Okay, so what's all that about? Well, playing the organ gives me tremendous pleasure, and I couldn't possibly do it without all of those. So I'm 70, I've kept them for so long, and I intend to keep them a bit longer. How is it, after all this time, I've managed to retain all my digits and managed not to sustain any serious injuries? Well, I treat all machines with respect. Tools, anything can be a risk, a potential hazard, and if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you'll certainly know I'm not an advocate of health and safety. The reverse. I think it's now gone so silly, health and safety regulations, that it's actually counterproductive. My personal view is that the vast majority of people have an inbuilt self-preservation gene. Okay, you might question this sometimes, seeing some of the foolish things some people do, but this video isn't aimed at them. There'll always be candidates for the Darwin Awards, and best thing to let them get on with it, because protecting them merely sods up the gene pool. Sorry about that. But from my own viewpoint, always treat these things with respect, whatever you're doing. When it comes to machines such as lathes, saws, most things have levers and controls. These all change the ratios of the chuck and drive. This one operates high and low gear changes. And whenever I work on the lathe, whenever I put a chuck in the lathe, I always make sure this lever is in the middle. It's no longer in drive. Although the machine is switched off, and the red handles generally indicate a motor being driven or power being applied. If this should get knocked, or some other fault, operation of this is now driving the motor, but it's not turning the chuck. It will only turn the chuck when that's engaged. So any operation I do on the lathe, if I've got my arm in there, measurements, tightening something up, undoing something, I've got into the habit of doing that. You never know, after all, when this lever is operated, in the downward position there's a brake which applies a brake to the clutch mechanism, clutch of the chuck. But all this actually does is it's spring operated, and it pushes a plunger onto a switch. Well, that switch provides current to the motor. The switch could fail, a bit of swarf could get in there, you could knock this handle. Accidents do and can happen, and you don't want them to happen when you've got your arm in there. So play it safe. If the machining entails long lengths of bar or shaft that pass through the headstock of the lathe, as is often the case, be sure to support the end of these shafts. By not doing so, this could easily get out of balance depending on the speed and thrash around, and injury could be caused. In my setup here in my workshop, to the left of my lathe, I have my pillar drill. I don't know if it shows here, well, it might do. And on my pillar drill I've set up a V-block on the table, which I've adjusted to the right height, which suitably supports the shaft. In fact, this shaft could go another 4 or 5 feet out through the window, and this is by far the safest way of doing it. Different materials represent different degrees of risk. most steels are not too bad, but if I ever deal with cast iron or bronze or brass, where the chips are very fine and fly all over the place, I always wear a pair of these, always. From a youngster, I remember doing a quick little job with a grinder without using glasses. And I remember a much older man whose opinion I very much appreciated came over, took me aside and showed me the error of my ways. And ever since I've had a sort of thing about eyes. We're on our last pair, don't forget, but I always remember him saying, "Lad, you know that you might well be able to eat your food with an artificial hand. You could well sort of kick a ball about, perhaps with an artificial leg, but you'll never see through a glass eye." And that has always stuck with me. So it's not sissy to use those, says he, as he's just dropped them. Here we have our pillar drill. You might think a machine such as this wouldn't be particularly hazardous with reasonable caution, but you'd be wrong. There's been more claret spilt on drilling machines than probably on lathes. And simple faults have caused this. If you're drilling very thin material, you shouldn't be using ordinary drills. With certain amounts of rake, you should have negative rake, so that the material, when it breaks through, doesn't climb up the fluke of the drill. But we don't. We tend to use standard drills for going through thin sheet. But in that case, clamp the work down to the table. If you're drilling bar, such as this, I've set up some holes around my table to drop in stops. So if it grabs or breaks through, the drill tries to take the material against the stop. It doesn't whirl around and smack my hands. Very, very common fault. If something can go wrong, then at some point in time it will. So it's far better not to have your hair go around with that, loose clothing or anything else. Be aware of the dangers. Band saws, chop saws, circular saws, rip saws, whatever you want to call them. Also represent a hazard. Always use a push stick to push material past the saw. Woodworking accidents, statistically speaking, are less likely than metalworking operations, but also statistically speaking, you're more likely to lose a limb working in a woodworking shop than you are in engineering. So it's your choice. Things also to consider is a clean working environment. Make sure there's nothing to trip up on. Leads on floors to machines, cables to equipment are lethal. It's far better to have them up in the air and risk a semi-garrotting than to trip over them, and it can happen. And involuntarily, if you do have a fall or trip, you put out your hand to save yourself, to brace yourself. And even machines that are not running can cause some really serious wounds. To all those people that have switched off long ago, and to those who still can't see where this video is going, I can only hope you don't have children. So, if you want to pick your nose, scratch your bum, or take up playing the violin,